Africa continues to be plagued by regional violence. The continent faces the world's highest number of active armed conflicts and displacement, driven by competition for resources, political instability and foreign interference. In Sudan, 30 months of war has displaced millions and reduced some cities, including the capital, Khartoum, to rubble. The paramilitary Rapid Support Forces now control Darfur as the humanitarian crisis deepens and peace efforts stall. CGTN's Naba Mohidin has this report from Port Sudan.
Once Africa's second largest country, Sudan is now a nation divided. Millions of civilians trapped in a deadly struggle. The war between the Sudanese military and the Rapid Support Forces has turned bustling Khartoum into a ghost city. What began as a political feud has spiraled into one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. Health, education, and the economy have all but collapsed.
Over 70% of the hospitals are out of service. The capital was occupied by the RSF militia for 2 years. Health facilities were occupied as well. This prevented any efforts to defeat the pandemics as the state was a war zone. And even medical staff were targeted and killed, and ambulances were looted.
With hospitals shut down and aid convoys struggling to reach conflict zones, civilians bear the heaviest cost.
We escaped under gunfire and lost my husband. I once lived in Omdurman, and after the RSF lost their ground there, the city was hit by diseases like cholera and malaria. Luckily, we're still alive, and that's something to hold on to.
For families like hers, Port Sudan offers a fragile safety, far from the front lines, but even farther from home. In Darfur, history is repeating itself. Fresh reports of atrocities echo the horrors of 20 years ago. The RSF tightened its grip on the region in late October and faces accusations of genocide, ethnic cleansing, and sexual violence. Peace efforts led by the US have so far made little progress.
What happened in El Fasher is part of what has been happening there for many years. RSF has always been genociders and a tool in the hands of genociders and their supporters. Non-Arab tribes are targeted as the RSF is implementing a demographic change. It is a systematic horror we saw in many regions in Sudan during April's war.
International aid agencies are struggling to meet the growing humanitarian needs.
Our assessments show that everyone is hungry in El Fasher, and 1 in 4 people face extreme hunger. WFP has warned that many families trapped in El Fasher are on the brink of starvation.
UN-backed analysis has confirmed famine in parts of South Kordofan and North Darfur. But amid despair, ordinary Sudanese are showing remarkable resilience. Across the country, young volunteers and community groups are stepping up, organizing food drives, sharing supplies, and keeping hope alive.
The biggest role is played by philanthropists. We just help those in need and deliver where we can. We may not stop the fighting, but we can keep our communities alive, connected, and hopeful.
Sudan's story is one of tragedy, but also of courage. From Khartoum to Darfur, from refugees camps to aid convoys, ordinary people continue to stand tall in the face of war. As wars spread across Africa, from Sudan to Congo, the Sahel to Ethiopia, voices like these remind the world that resilience still endures, even when peace feels out of reach. Naba Mohidin, CGTN, Port Sudan.
There is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Kingsley Moghalu is the former Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria. He currently heads the Institute for Governance and Economic Transformation. Yasir Zaidan served as a lecturer at the National University in Sudan. He now teaches international studies at the University of Washington. Also with us is David Monyae. He's the director of the University of Johannesburg Center for Africa-China Studies and Abdullahi Boru Halakhe is an Africa security and policy analyst. Thanks everyone for being with us. Abdullahi, let's start right here in the studio. Let's look at some of the figures. The International Committee of the Red Cross says there are more than 50 active armed conflicts across Africa. That's a 45% increase since 2020. We have conflicts in the Sahel, Ethiopia and Sudan that's causing a regional crisis of instability. And then this has led to, of course, the highest number of internally displaced persons, an estimated 45.7 million people. These are very different conflicts, different by caused by different motives, etc. But what's your assessment? Why has it been so difficult to resolve some of these which have been going on for years?
That's a very good question, Adnan. I mean, thank you for again highlighting some of these critical African issues. I think let's unpack. Let's start with Sudan, which provides a template for many of the conflicts in the region. Here's a country, one of the largest countries on the continent. 20 years ago, we had similar problems. One of the first indictments of ICC was in Sudan. At that time, there's tremendous amount of energy inside and outside Africa to control the Sudanese crisis that led to the secession of South Sudan. 20 years later, same template, we have famine in one part of Sudan. Famine alone would have, ignited people to take action. We have genocide in one part of the country. Genocide alone would have made us to take action. Both are taking place in Sudan and no action is being taken. I think at its root, many of the African institutions that were really playing a vital role, including in Sudan, that led to the signing of Comprehensive Peace Agreement 2005, are not functioning. Additionally, we are seeing the fraying of post-1945 world order. Now, the biggest player in Sudan is the United Arab Emirates that is allegedly backing RSF, and that makes it very difficult. Sudan is not an African conflict. In many ways, it is not a regional conflict. It is not an it is a conflict that involves African countries as well as Gulf countries and mercenaries from Colombia.
David Monyae, Abdullahi makes the point that a lot of what we are seeing now on the continent of Africa is the result of arrangements that were made after the end of World War II, after 1945. Colonialism created issues. These issues have endured and contributes to many of the issues that Africa and problems that Africa faces right now. We have European bureaucrats who drew these borders without any regard for the people who actually live there. How has that and subsequent political instability contributed to the kinds of ethnic and tribal conflicts we see right now? David, can you hear me? Oh, David can't hear me. Okay, let me go to Yasir Zaidan. Yasir, great to have you with us. As we heard from our report, the ongoing civil war erupted in Sudan in 2023 between the Sudanese Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Group. This has led to a humanitarian crisis. Here is the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres. This is what he said. Let's listen.
In Sudan, I'm gravely concerned by recent reports of mass atrocities and gross human rights violations in El Fasher and worsening violence in the Kordofans. The flow of weapons and fighters from external parties must be cut off. The flow of humanitarian aid must be able to quickly reach civilians in need. The hostilities must stop. And I call on the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces to engage with my personal envoy for Sudan, Ramtan Lamamra, and take swift, tangible steps towards a negotiated settlement.
So, yes, realistically, do you see a negotiated settlement in the near future, or are the two sides too far apart? And is this actually being driven by foreign interference as well, as Abdullahi pointed out?
First, thank you very much for having me, Anand. I think I agree with Abdullah. This war is primarily a war of aggression by a part of the United Arab Emirates against Sudan and against Sudanese people and Sudanese civilians. The RSF is merely an agent, but also what we have seen in Al-Fashir, the atrocity in Al-Fashir, is also the failure of international institutions to intervene. We know that the United Nations Security Council have called for the end of the siege of Al-Fashir, but without any kind of response. The whole world saw al-Fashir fall into the hand of the RSF after almost 2 years without any action. So what I would say is that the UN is dead in the sands of al-Fashir, like the blood that we have seen, from satellite imaging is just like a proof that these institutions are no longer valid.
And yes, if we look at what's happening regionally, I mean, neighboring countries are basically following policies of their own rather than coming together to try and resolve the conflict within their midst. I mean, countries are either backing one side or the other. I mean, to what extent is that contributing to the continuation of this conflict?
Absolutely. So what's happening in Sudan is also, the regional institutions are not functioning. Like the IGAD, the kind of like a multilateral institution in East Africa is not having any kind of initiative to solve this problem. But some countries from the region itself, like some neighboring country to Sudan, are weaponizing and enabling the RSF, which is a genocidal militia, to conduct their war against the Sudanese people. Like these are the countries that should be mediating, that should be making initiative to end the war. But as Abdullahi said in the beginning, this is a different decade. Like 20 years ago, we saw a Kenyan initiative to end the Sudanese civil war. We saw the EU ramping up this initiative and supporting it, which illuminated in the 2005 Comprehensive Peace Agreement. But these regional and continental institutions are absent in this war, and that because of, again, the United Arab Emirates kind of influence. We saw that influence in the IGAD initiative to end the war previously in 2024 and 2023 as well. Also, the EU, there is no any kind of initiative to end the war.
David Monyae, I hope you can hear me right now. As I was saying, that many of the issues we see on the continent of Africa right now is a legacy of colonialism. It's the way the colonial powers left the African countries at independence. I mean, many of these borders were artificially drawn by bureaucrats, by civil servants sitting in these European capitals. How has that and the subsequent political instability led to conditions that we find now?
I think what the colonialists did is to divide Africans, ethnic groups, divided between 2 or 3 countries. And the manner in which it was done is that by the time they left certain areas with much more economic activities, while others in an uneven development within and across the African continent. And even though they left, they really did not, because they also had a control and the kind of a structure that most African countries entered into, a post-1945 world order, was never friendly to all economic activities of the continent. And this coupled with internal challenges, corruption, not all countries, but some, and misgovernance also led to this. But lately, we have seen with the global financial crisis of 2008, the COVID-19, and the current Trump administration, at a global level, there's absolutely no common position in terms of how to respond, as more and more countries are building walls, not wanting to strengthen multilateralism, and that in itself leaves regional bodies and smaller states with no sufficient resources to respond to some of the challenges that otherwise could be easily be resolved.
Kingsley Moghalu, Africa is a continent with vast natural resources, but you will often hear from African leaders as well as other Africans as well saying that this is both a blessing and it's a curse as well at the same time, because there's competition over these vast resources. A lot of that competition is driven by the consumers, by Western countries, by former colonial powers. And despite the riches that the continent has, we still find poverty, entrenched corruption, this inadequate infrastructure in many places. Do you see a correlation between countries having vast natural resources and a sort of propensity for conflict?
Yes, there is that correlation. First of all, a number of colleagues here have said, have pointed to the fundamental problem of state formation in Africa, which I think is the most important driver of conflict. And secondly, the absence of competent and visionary governance. The level of leadership needed to manage the consequences of, disparate same peoples being cut off by different countries does not exist. And then you have the problem of corruption. And so that's why these resources have not been able to turn into wealth, because the leadership problem in the continent has not allowed this to happen. So a lot of the blame must go to the leadership in the continent. Yes, we know that there are external actors, but Africa is not the only place with natural resources.
Yeah.
Norway has oil. The Gulf states have oil. A lot of other countries, China has a lot of minerals. So why is it that in the case of Africa, these natural resources drive conflict instead of creating wealth? The responsibility must squarely rest on Africans themselves and their leadership. If you allow yourself to be exploited by external forces, you are responsible for your exploitation because you let it happen.
How does that change, Kingsley? How does one how does one introduce a more democratic order and one that is accountable to the people?
Yes, I mean, part of the problem, as you indicate, is that the experiment with democracy in Africa has not gone very well. But, there are ways to govern effectively, even if you are not so democratic. The Gulf states are not democracies, but they're well governed. So we have to distinguish between governance and democracy and understand that democracy is not in itself the beginning and the end of the solution to the problem. So we have to focus on leadership and governance. Investing in education is very important, because a lot of illiterate young people are just a talent pool for these militias. That's one. Second, you have to create jobs. You have to create skills. So there has to be an economic approach as well as a political leadership approach with accountability. And African countries just have not been able to establish a culture of accountability.
Abdullahi, let's talk about the Democratic Republic of Congo. That's another country that's mired in conflict. And there's widespread human rights abuses, corruption, there's hunger. This is Cynthia Jones of the World Food Programme talking about the challenges that this country is facing. Let's listen.
New displacement continues as the fighting continues. Though people have been forced from their home over and over again. In the eastern part, there's about 5.2 million displaced people, including 1.6 million that have been displaced this year alone, making DRC one of the world's largest displaced person crises. Hunger is deepening and getting worse. Funding is running out, and we will only be able to support a fraction of those in need.
So, Abdullahi, looking at the origins of the conflict there, is this another example of competition for natural resources combined with outside interference, in this instance, from neighboring states?
If in the case of Sudan, the external actors, that is the Gulf countries and countries in the region, are the main drivers, DRC fits the classic case of your resources being a curse. We're speaking about the fourth industrial revolution, where for all this technology that we need, a significant amount of those natural resources that drove, the Silicon Valley in, iPhones, computers that are required now for the next stage is in the DRC. Dare I remind us that the uranium that was used in Nagasaki and Hiroshima were mined from the DRC. So DRC has been mired in this for a very long time. But like my brother said here, as long as the internal dynamics of the Democratic Republic of Congo is not resolved, then we'll have the same problem. Yeah. Just to give you an example, the crisis in the East, where the DRC, where Rwanda accuses the DRC of harboring, post-1994 rebel groups inside the country and therefore interfering it, the resolution to that conflict was in Qatar. But when DRC had similar problems a couple of years ago, where 7 African countries were involved in conflict, that crisis was resolved in Lusaka using the Lusaka Agreement. Right. So I think we're living through a world where many of multilateral institutions at regional level and continental level on the continent are really failing. What John from DRC is speaking, the UN person, is the symptoms. The underlying drivers are within the DRC and the regional countries.
Okay, gentlemen, we are rapidly running out of time, but I want to get back to all of you. David, I want to ask you about other factors that are driving conflict, driving instability, things like climate change. I mean, to what extent is that a cause of what we're seeing?
Oh, indeed. The continent is also suffering from climate change. I think if you look what's happening in Sahel, where the communities are fighting over grazing land, and there's quite a number of other areas where people basically have no food. But we also, as much as I agree with my colleagues, let's take Libya, for instance, 2011. It was a perfectly run, not democratic, but perfectly run country, doing extremely well. And the decision was made by Europeans, assisted by Americans, to bomb the country. And some of the challenges we have across the Sahel, up to West Africa, are caused by the Libyan crisis in terms of massive injection of weapons, uncontrollable. So you see this tendency where multiple factors, climate, injections of weapons in an uncontrollable, at times supporting all groups just to bring chaos in a country. Our own neighbor, Mozambique, in the northern Mozambique, was never had any crisis until they find gas. Right. All of a sudden, there is a crisis. And I think you see more and more scenarios in which certain minerals are discovered and all of a sudden there's a crisis in that given country.
Yeah. Yasir Zaidan, let's look at Somalia for a minute. We have, conflict and climate change causing widespread challenges there, unemployment, and we've seen some of the worst human rights abuses, women and children being exploited, sexually exploited, sexual violence. What is the status of what is going on there right now?
I think Somalia is one of the countries that are really hit hard by the international system, especially during the Cold War. And today, after it has done some kind of development, there is some stability. They're doing very well, but with the international system again failing in protecting that new development, the Somalis are gonna suffer from, as you mentioned, climate change, but also security instability. One of the examples is that you see their sovereignty is also challenged by the Gulf states, especially with the issue of Somaliland and building ports in Puntland and Bosaso. This is also very challenging to this new development in Mogadishu.
Kingsley, if we look at a combination of these conflicts, if we look at what is going on in the Sahel, for instance, as well as in the DRC, it's caused a massive displacement of people. Millions of people have been displaced. What is the economic impact of that?
Huge. Africa loses about 30% of its potential GDP every year, and not less than $20 billion every year is lost, to these conflicts. A lot of unemployment. So it perpetuates the poverty cycle. There can be no wealth, there can be no prosperity without peace. So the economic impact is very clear. Now, what's the solution? The first place to begin the solution to Africa's wars is to appeal to a collective sense of shame in Africa. Africans, too, are God's children, entitled to a place under the sun, just like the people in Japan, or Turkey, or Malaysia, or China, or Washington. So Africans have not developed a worldview in our countries of who we are as Africans and what is our destiny, what's our destination. So a lot of the discourse must go very deep below the surface where we tend to discuss these things and go to the levels of psychology, philosophy, and who we are.
Abdullahi, I've got about 90 seconds. You know, you were talking earlier on about some of the efforts that are made to resolve these crises. What are the mechanisms that exist within the African Union, for instance?
If African Union is very serious, it has the elders, people like former president of Nigeria, former president of South Africa, but it also has regional mechanisms. But I don't think those mechanisms are starting. They need a vision of people at the African Union and sub-African continental bodies to really start working. Otherwise, the billions that he's talking will go to bleed them for a very long time.
All right, and the other problem, I guess, Abdullahi, is that like the United Nations, the AU does not have any kind of enforcement mechanism.
It doesn't. What AU has is enforcing its normative mechanisms. For instance, in Sudan, where, you know, responsibility to protect was invoked. But now what we have is utter indifference. Like right now, how can you have peace process on Sudan being led by Quad? Peace process in the DRC is done in Qatar. They can help, but AU should be the one leading that.
Right.
But
which goes back to what I was saying about that sense of dignity and self.
Okay, and we unfortunately have to leave it there. We've run out of time. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington.